is so great to see so many people here interested in seeing our transportation challenges being resolved in a common sense and practical way, and we're just thrilled about that. The best thing, though, about our speaker today is that he's not coming from Washington, he's not coming from California, he's not coming from Texas. He lives right here in the middle of this mess. Baruch Feigenbaum lives in Atlanta. He's had lengthy roots in Atlanta. He's worked for Congressman Lynn Westmoreland in D.C. He is a Georgia Tech grad, and my apologies to all the UGA folks, but he's great anyway. Oops, sorry, Kelly. Baruch he's the Reason Foundation transportation analyst. He serves on several of the federal boards, the Transportation Research Board committees. He worked with us last year on the study that we did, focusing on the T-SPLOST last year, and he did an excellent job on that. Everybody used his data, and we're looking forward to hearing how he takes that study and steps further in this one. We're really excited about this. His ties to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation have been great. We work with him lots on transportation, and we're so pleased that Reason Foundation agreed to release the study that Baruch has done at our event today. So, thank you. Come on.
And thanks very much, especially thanks to Benita for that introduction. My goodness, I'm starting to feel so old after accomplishing all of those things. But I also want to personally also thank CSX for sponsoring this event. I think most people know that port, especially with the deepening of the Port of Savannah, excuse me, should I say freight with the deepening of the Port of Savannah, is a big deal in this state. And I always like to remind people that the American freight network is actually the most efficient and also the cheapest for a developed country in the world, which is something we often take for granted. And if we didn't have the freight network, the cost of buying a lot of the goods we do would be a lot more expensive. And I also want to thank GPPF as well. For those of us who sometimes go to other think tanks, present at other places around the country, I want to say that we're really lucky here in Georgia. I find myself particularly lucky since I live here to have the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, who I think does the best job of any of these state think tanks, because not only do they come up with great reports, but they know how to actually get the suggestions implemented and how to work with folks. And I can't tell you that a lot of think tanks around the country don't necessarily work that way, and it's really important. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, let me go ahead and get started because I've got quite a few slides here and we've only got 25 minutes. So I'm going to try to go pretty quickly. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. What this basically is this is sort of my plan B. We heard a lot when we had the TIA that if we don't pass this, there's no plan B. We're going to fall off the cliff and it's going to be very bad. And I would suggest that there are other options. And this is an option I've been working on for almost a year now, looking at what we can do realistically, politically, in terms of how much funding is available, the projects that actually are the best ones, not necessarily just the projects that are politically the best. And so this is the report that I've come up with. It is 110 pages, so if you're having trouble falling asleep one night, you can just whip it out and hopefully it'll help. But I think, obviously, if it's not covered in this presentation today, it'll be in my report. So let me go ahead and get going. Make sure I push the right button here. Wonderful. Okay, so I just want to go ahead and start with the summary. Basically, I'm going to first talk about the congestion issues and the mobility problems that we have in Metro Atlanta. I'm going to talk about the existing plans that we have right now. There's not anything that you can point to as the master plan of what we're doing, but the planning organizations around Atlanta have some plans. Talk a little bit about congestion, and then talk about the solutions in terms of a general purpose freeway capacity, managed lanes, arterial networks, ITS, intelligent transportation systems, the transit network, which is something we absolutely can't forget about in Atlanta, and then lastly, the always Trinity funding and financing. So let me just start with the congestion and mobility issues. And you can see these numbers, they're everywhere, they're not new, but I just wanted to go ahead and pick out a few and highlight them. So in 1982, the average delay per commuter in Atlanta was 13 hours. In 2011, which is the last year that we have info for, it's risen to 43 hours, which is more than a 300% increase. And I would point out that at 2011, we were still in the recession, somewhat recovering. So obviously, in future years, it's going to be getting a lot worse than that. That's $2.5 billion in delays and excess fuel costs. I would also point out from the transit point of view, only 3.6% of jobs in the metro area are accessible by transit in 45 minutes, which is one reason why people don't take it, because it doesn't work. We might want to work on that. The percent of people commuting by transit actually declined more than 50% since MARTA Rail opened. So when I say percent, I mean before MARTA opened, 9.1% of the people in what was the metro area commuted by transit. Now, since that, which has been 32 years, I believe, we're now down to 4.6%. Again, depends which numbers you look at, but not a positive one way or the other. Okay, but you may have heard that VMT is decreasing. Everyone says the vehicle miles are decreasing. We're not going to have a problem. People are traveling less. And the answer to that is yes, nationwide VMT is decreasing, but it's not in Atlanta. And the reason for that is simple. While the VMT per capita is decreasing slowly, slightly I should say, and I should add, nobody knows why that is. Most people think it's the recession. You've got 20 different reasons out there, but nobody really knows which one it is. Because the population in Atlanta is growing, the total VMT in Atlanta is increasing. And actually, the Metro Atlanta freeway vehicle miles traveled, as measured by the Texas Transportation Institute, set a record in 2011 of 49.5 million miles. So, not decreasing in Atlanta. Okay, so let me talk a little bit now about our existing plans. And just a little bit of very quick, brief intro of how we come to these plans. So, the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Atlanta, has short-term and long-range plans. GDOT has similar plans for rural areas outside of metro areas, and other metro planning organizations, say for Savannah, Columbus, Augusta, etc., also have plans. You've got the STIP, or the TIP, which is the short-term plan, and the long-range plan. And when ARC created the 2040 plan, it focused on three scenarios. Constrained growth, which is what I like to call the Portland effect, which is where you have strict growth boundaries and you only allow growth in certain areas, which does constrain growth. It also tends to increase real estate prices. Sprawl, the pejorative term, which is basically allowing growth wherever it happens, and the negatives there can be increased infrastructure costs and environmental effects. And they chose to go with the local policy, which is a combination of the two. Now, I don't necessarily think sprawl is bad. The issues with sprawl are the infrastructure costs can be higher because people live further out. But if you price that infrastructure correctly, you're not going to have that issue. So it's really a policy failure, not necessarily a sprawl failure. And the environmental issues, which include farmland loss, limited access to water, can be resolved. They also tend to be greatly exaggerated. Because of the farming revolution, we actually produce far more food on far fewer acres than we need. So, far fewer acres than we can realistically consume, much more efficient than we used to be. So that's not really that big of an issue. I also want to touch on Livable Communities initiative, or Livable Centers initiative, and TransitOriented Development. Now, both of these are good in principle and can be good if they're actually implemented correctly, but we got a few challenges. So incentivizing development, particularly in central city areas, which is where we tend to like to do that, can harm and displace low-income folks. And the reason it does that is because it increases property values, and a lot of low-income folks can no longer afford to live there. The higher-income folks who replace the lower-income folks actually take transit a lot less than the lower-income folks, and the lower-income folks are now in the suburbs where the transit coverage is not as good. And this is not some study that the Reason Foundation came up with. A professor at UCLA, Brian Taylor, who's the chair of the Urban Planning Department, actually has been working on this a lot. And I want to talk a little bit more specifically about transit-oriented developments. Okay, so Thompson and Brown, who are two other professors at Florida State, one who's chair of the Light Rail Transit Committee, so again, not a recent study, said that TODs in Atlanta do not have a real important factor in transit ridership, which means while they might have other positive benefits, and I'm not saying they don't, they do not increase transit ridership significantly. Midtown and North Avenue had a small effect. Lindbergh or Decatur, if you've ever been to Decatur, you know all the activity that's going on around there, and that activity is great, but that activity is not there because of the transit line. That activity is there for other factors. So because of that, the plan that I've been working on is a little bit different. It focuses on creating a network of highways and transit, and it tries to have users pay as much of the cost of the trips as possible to be more economically efficient. There's a focus on regional, not corridors. And what I mean by that is, if you're trying to get from Alpharetta to Marietta, how are you going to get there? Are we going to look at just one corridor, or are we going to look at a range of options that people can actually use? Traditionally, transportation planning has been a little too corridor focused. They look at the region as well, but it often goes down to looking at the specific corridor. And then I also have facilities that help, what I say, help both cars and transit, such as managed lanes, and I'm going to get into that a little more in the next few slides. Okay, so a little bit of background here on congestion. It's not all the same. It's a very little background because I don't want to bore you. We have non-recurrent congestion, which is basically congestion that happens from traffic accidents, weather, all these sort of things, and recurrent congestion, which is when there's just too many cars on a stretch of highway. The non-recurrent congestion, we're actually doing a very good job of addressing in Georgia. GDOT has some real good programs. The HERO and the TRIP program, which sort of give people tows, move them out of the way. Sort of our new approach for winter weather. We haven't had a major winter storm in a few years, so we'll see how this works. But I'm confident that we'll be better than the last major winter storm we had a few years ago. Georgia Highway Patrol stations officers on the downtown connector because that is a rather dangerous road because of all the merging, and so they're ready when an accident occurs. And then better warning of work zones, navigator, online tools, things of that sort. Now, recurrent congestion is a little bit trickier, which is probably the reason we haven't solved it yet. We have a solution that's basically going to include both general purpose and managed lanes. Generally, in Atlanta, we're going to do more on managed lanes, and I'll get to that why in a reason. So for example, looking at the types of freeway issues we have, you have freeway bottlenecks, which is, say, I-285 State Road 400 interchange. We're all familiar with that. You have modest freeway additions, which I would suggest perhaps looking at additional general purpose lanes in I-75 in Henry County, a western bypass of Atlanta, and then the managed lane networks, which is adding managed lanes to I-285, among other things. And what I want to say about why, people often ask, well, why shouldn't we just add more free lanes? We should add more free lanes everywhere. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, it's very expensive. We don't have the money to pay for it. But the second problem is what we have, which is a phenomenon called induced demand. And since I did a little mini thesis in graduate school, I'm just going to subject some of that to you, some of it to you right now. What it is when metro areas like Atlanta are growing, more people are going to use the highway. And you also have, when you widen that road, and you're still in a growing area, you're going to have more people using it just because you've got trips that would not be made. You're also going to have trips that are not made due to congestion. So, someone in Alpharetta, pick on them again, wants to go to the Braves game. They're not necessarily going to go because the traffic congestion right now is too bad. But if you widen that road, they may then choose to go because it will be easier. So you've got new trips. And so, because of that, general purpose capacity is not necessarily the way to go. And I don't want to say, by the way, that induced demand means you shouldn't ever widen highways. Some interests have taken it that way. That's not what it means. It just means that you should consider the consequences of adding free lanes, and in a growing area they're likely to be used. All right, so I now have some maps to help you illustrate what I'm talking about. This map shows new freeway capacity suggested in the report in Metro Atlanta. You can see most of it is outside. In fact, I think all of it is outside the perimeter. Most of the stretches are very, very short, with a few exceptions. You see the I-75, which needs some issues in Henry County, and I-20 in DeKalb County. But again, relatively, considering our freeway network, not real expansive. All right, well, let me talk a little bit more specifically about managed lanes. So some of you who have lived in Georgia for a while know we've had quite a history with them. The original version was a 1,200-mile HUV network, high-occupancy vehicle. The problem is HUV lanes are subject to what I call the Goldilocks theory. And you can see this on current HUV lanes we have in Atlanta. They're either too hot or they're too cold. They're seldom just right. When they're too hot, you've got too many people using them, which means traffic speeds slow down to basically what they are in the general purpose lanes, and there's no incentive to use them. When they're too cold, you've got nobody using them, and then everyone in the general purpose lane is complaining, this stupid lane, why do we have it, nobody's using them. So it's very hard to get them right. I don't think we have one that I would consider just right in Atlanta, or have ever had one since we put them in for the Olympics. So what happened was a group of different agencies, you can see Federal Highway, GDOT, CERTA, the Transit Planning Board, the Chamber of Commerce, got on board with the managed lanes. Because with managed lanes, you use pricing and different other, sometimes occupancy as well, to make sure that you have the right amount of vehicles in it. And the target in Atlanta is 45 miles an hour, and there's reasons for that, such as traffic at 45 miles an hour, you can fit more cars in it, but let's not get to that. So, this is the managed lane network. And this network is actually fairly similar to what HNTB proposed in a study for GDOT in 2010. I've added a few little extensions. You've got one here on I-85 South. You've got another one on I-675 South. We also have the controversial North-South Tunnel in Atlanta, which is east of the downtown connector. And I don't want to get too much into that, but let me just say that the downtown connector is the most congested, has the highest number of accidents, is a real issue. When we did the modeling, we looked at all sorts of scenarios we could come up with, and there was no real substitute to this east, sort of north-south connector, I call it. Now, it would have to be a tunnel because of real estate values, and if you read the presentation, you'll see that successfully we've built tunnels under Seattle. They're actually building right now through an earthquake zone, in Paris, under Versailles. So it's not necessarily as big an issue, but it is something we're going to have to look at, although the costs are certainly not cheap. Implementation of this managed lane network is going to require public-private partnerships, which have also been a tad controversial. We've gone through several modifications of the law. First, only the private sector could propose, and we allow the public sector. The bottom line is in 2011, the original I-75, I-575 public-private partnership was canceled due to what I call bogus concerns. And so what are some of those bogus concerns? I don't have time to go into all of them, but I just want to list 4 that I think I've heard a lot in Georgia. So the first one is PPPs cost Georgia citizens jobs. And the reality is that even when the PPP is operated by an international company, they hire Georgia workers, because you cannot build a highway in Australia. You can't build I-75 there and transport it by boat over here. It doesn't work. The other thing I've heard is that PPP deals prevent state and local officials from improving area roads. That's so sort of non-compete. And so for the I-75, 575 contract, the actual contract language says the state was actually able to build a new parallel road 10 feet away from I-75. There was not a single thing in their plan they couldn't have built. They could have improved US 41, they could have improved any road. The only thing they could not have added was general purpose lanes. I would point out to you that some sections of I-75 are 15 lanes wide, making it the widest freeway in the country. How realistic is it, considering funding issues, that we would add more general purpose lanes? I would argue not realistic at all. Another myth is PPPs commit future generations to unreasonable long-term contracts. No, I don't think they're unreasonable. Of course, there's ways to modify them, and that's key. But that's not any different than any other lottery, infrastructure type contracts that you otherwise have. And then one of my favorites is the private sector is going to raise toll rates to astronomical levels. The private sector is going to raise toll rates to the amount needed to reduce congestion. But the state has mechanisms, if they want to make sure they keep those toll rates low, to do so. Now that's going to affect the value of the contract, obviously, but you don't see astronomical levels. Okay, so that's a little bit on the freeway network and in the managed lanes. I next want to talk about the arterial network. The arterial network is sort of the backbone of the transportation network, roads such as State Road 120, US 41 that we all use. Metro Atlanta has spent most of the past 40 years spending money on the freeway network, which means we have some very wide freeways. The problem is we have many very bad arterials that don't provide an alternative. And so what happens is when you've got an accident on one of the freeways, traffic backs up for miles and miles, and there's not any good alternatives. So the arterial plan that we have basically includes two types of arterials. One is these new regional primary arterials that I will show on the map in a minute, and the other is all other arterials. And again, there's more details on the other arterials, turn lane improvements, other things in the report. I also want to briefly highlight this, and I don't want to make too much of this, sort of the managed arterial. My colleague Bob Poole, this is one of the things he helped develop, and I think it's a promising idea, but it's obviously not for use everywhere. What it says is that for a small fee, it might be appropriate to have underpasses and bypasses at congested intersections. They've studied this in Fort Myer. Transportation Research Board has studied it. Small tolls of 25 to 50 cents. In the report, I identified one corridor in Atlanta that I think this is appropriate for. Again, this is just a test, but I think it has a lot of possibilities. Okay, so this map shows the arterial network. And what you'll notice is you've basically got roads, in many cases, paralleling I-285 and your freeways, and also multiple roads if you look north of I-285. And what that does is that allows a transit alternative for the people coming from north parts of Atlanta, or for that matter, people south of the perimeter, east of the perimeter, west of the perimeter, even inside of the perimeter, to make a trip now on a highway that's going to have some limited access features, better traffic light synchronization, other things. Specifically, some of those things it's going to have are ITS systems. And just as a brief intro, ITS, Intelligent Transportation Systems, GDOT actually won an award from the Intelligent Transportation Society of America for traffic signal timing a couple years ago. And the challenge in 2013 is to use these systems for not just traffic signal timing, but also to reduce congestion in the first place, so you don't actually need to go and see where it's congested. And so this ITS systems are going to be one of the things that we use on these managed arterials to keep traffic flowing and offer sort of a better quality trip than we have now. What I call variable traffic signal synchronization. We're also talking about queue jumps, which are for transit service. I'll get into that in a second. Access management and grade separation. And I now have some pictures of each of these things. These are not the best of pictures. No, it's not a stream of uninterrupted green lights, but what I'm trying to say is you have different intersections, and the idea is the green lights are working with each other, and they're more synchronized. I wish I could have come up with a better picture, but this said. I do want to point out the queue jump, which is that one right there. That's used a lot in bus rapid transit. What it does is it offers a priority green signal to transit vehicles so that there is an advantage to being in a transit vehicle. A lot of people will not take buses now because they say it's just as slow as car. And if it's going to be as slow as my car, I'm going to ride in my car because I like my car and I can listen to my music and all the rest of it. But with these queue jumps and with some other improvements, it's not. It's actually significantly faster in some of the metro areas that have done this, and we're actually way behind than BRT in the US compared to other countries because we've had a thing for rail. You can see the access management, restricting of turns, and then grade separation is pretty self-explanatory. All right, transit. So the idea here is to create what I call a redundant transit network, which means you've got almost a network, sort of a grid-based network. Now in transit, it doesn't work quite the same way as roads, so it's not quite that simple, but that's the basic idea. And so this could be things like using a MARTA rail. Maybe you're going to look at adding additional stations, but no rail expansions. And when I say additional stations, I think something like on the north-south line between the current Art Center station and Lindbergh. There's a lot going on in that area. Maybe we'll look at that. Talking about additional local bus routes with increased frequency, additional express bus routes, those are the ones that SERTA runs with frequency, and 20 BRT routes. And the key here is a mobility management center that's going to help coordinate this and also deal with other types of services that I think we should be expanding: van pooling, carpooling, demand response transit. And the importance of the Mobility Management Center is you have someone that's sort of working with all of these different transit agencies to try to get a unified plan, as opposed to what we have now, which is basically a patchwork of local service, and good luck if you're trying to go from one county to the next. I also mentioned the non-traditional van pools. A quick word about casual car pools. These are used a lot in Washington and Houston, and what happens is drivers go to sort of designated locations, and then other passengers who are looking for a ride to a similar area can jump in. And someone told me, this sounds very dangerous. Can we really do this? And I said, well, they've been doing it for 10 years in Houston, and they have not had a single problem. So my response is, yes, we can. Rural areas, less populated counties, also looking at demand response transit. I also think we need to use the three principles of what I call good transit service. We're talking about contracting and competitive bidding. So when you have a transit route, instead of just the transit agency operating it all the time, you open it up to outside contractors to see if they can offer better service at a lower price. Time of day and distance-based pricing. Some of you may be familiar. I had an op-ed in the AJC last week, and Marta's not necessarily on the same page as me on this, but I do think that for a metro area like Atlanta that's dispersed, distance-based pricing can help offer better service, because the fact that I can get on the North Spring station and go to the airport for only $2.50 during rush hour seems crazy low to me, considering how much it would actually cost to drive. And that's not an area where you have social income issues, so I don't know why we're not charging more for that. And the Metro Mobility Management Center. Okay, so here is quickly a map of the new express, bus, and BRT service. The blue lines, most of them are now run by CERTA. There might be a few additions, and the red are the BRT lines. Again, there'll probably be modifications, changes, but this provides a general map. Outside Metro Atlanta, I just want to quickly highlight here, as I'm running out of time, there's two goals: creating a network of freeways, and the idea here is both for freight traffic that's coming from the Port of Savannah and bound for Alabama and Tennessee, and also for passenger vehicles that are not going through Atlanta. The way our freeway network is set up now, you have to go through Atlanta. And it's not a lot of traffic, but it's surprising how few vehicles actually makes a difference in reducing congestion. And we also have some stuff in there to improve local and state roads, because obviously there's congestion outside of Atlanta. And I'm going to show you a very ugly slide here. I'm going to apologize in advance. I have not finalized the maps. You can see my Google Maps version, and I do apologize for that. But this basically just shows you some of the improvements on this on this freeway network, and you can see there's some in around Augusta, Savannah, Columbus, heading up toward Chattanooga, where there's a big bottleneck, and around Metro Atlanta. So I will get a better picture of that map soon. And I last want to discuss the funding and financing resources. Okay, this is the big deal. Everyone says, how are you going to pay for it? This is a great plan. We don't have the money. Okay, the most efficient system, from my perspective, is a user pay, user benefit system. From the simple point that the people who are actually using the infrastructure are the ones paying for it. We have a gas tax now, and that's a pretty good version of a user pay, user benefit system. One of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of other types of taxes such as the sales tax, is because everyone pays, but only certain people benefit. And there's really no relationship to how much transportation you use and how much you pay. And there's actually taxes significantly worse than the sales tax that are even worse for transportation. So the question is, tolling and public-private partnerships, I should add, are also a major point of it. Most people think that the Georgia gas tax supports transportation. So we have a brief quiz that I'm not going to give you actually any time to answer. I'm just going to run through the questions. The first question is, where does Georgia rank in transportation funding per capita? You see I have answers anywhere from 20th to 48th. The second question is, what percentage of gasoline tax actually funds transportation? So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide and enter them. Most of you probably know that Georgia ranks 48th in per capita funding for transportation. Not much. It's kind of one of the reasons we have the problems we have. But you probably don't know that of the average 30.2 cent statewide gasoline sales tax, only 16.35 cents of that go to transportation, which is about 54%. And why is that? Well, there's a few reasons, and it's so confusing in some levels, I actually had to make a chart so I could try to explain this. We've got the 7.5 cent excise tax, all of that supports transportation. We've got the state sales tax, which on fuel, which is 4%, and only 3 of those 4 cents support transportation, and the rest of it goes to the general fund, which is basically not spent on transportation. Then we've got these local sales taxes, which range from 2 to 4%. Now, obviously, they're for local needs in counties, and I do not want to get into a fight with counties over funding. I would just point out, though, that the amount that those counties collect on the gasoline portion purchases is rather insignificant compared to the amount they collect overall, but would make a humongous difference for transportation. I think we do need some other sources. One thing I talked about was an electric car fee. It's not going to bring in a heck of a lot of money right now. Obviously, we don't have a lot of electric cars. I do think we will in the future, and I do think that in terms of user pay, user benefits, since electric cars don't use gasoline, they need to contribute. Tolling, I've mentioned a little bit about all electronic tolling. The collection costs are similar to fuel taxes. I consider it an even better user fee than gasoline tax because you're actually paying for the road you're using, so it doesn't get much more efficient than that. And let me also detail the transit part of it. Now, the state match for transit's a little bit challenging, and I'm trying to figure out where basically we can get it, and I'm looking at different departments, and I don't want to, do much. I want to highlight that the transit is important, and I think we might want to consider housing it in the Department of Community Affairs as opposed to DOT, because the reality is the Department of Transportation, transit's always going to be a lower priority as compared to the amount of people who use vehicles, people who use cars in Georgia compared to transit. I also think we ought to look at how we prioritize our resources. I don't particularly think funding from the public coffers, the Go Fish Center, or the State History Museum is as important as transit. History Museum is important. There's some innovative private options out there that other states have done. I think we can look at it. I would also point out that Georgia is going to be, for good or bad, flush with cash, so to speak, because budget projections are better. This is the time to look at putting some of that funding into transit. And I also want to briefly highlight financing. Financing is not funding. It is a tool to leverage funding. And it's using PPPs, TIFIA, which is a type of federal loans, Garvey bonds, GAN bonds, private activity bonds, value capture. I think would be particularly useful for transit. MARTA is going to have to do some significant upgrades to its rail network. It's approaching the time when rail upgrades need to be made. I think value capture is one way that they can help pay for that. And financing in terms of PPPs using the private sector actually allows you to get about 50% of the resources you need to build the managed lanes. So financing is important. You need a basic funding base to do financing, but we have that in Georgia. And so this is my second to the last slide here. The total statewide new funds, and it's a tad confusing, and I apologize for that. MA means Metro Atlanta, and state means state. And so you're looking at this and how you get the totals. Obviously, some things like the managed arterials would only be a Metro Atlanta solution. Your BRT is Metro Atlanta, local bus is statewide, but this is just to show you the breakdown of the different numbers. And with that, as I approach 1 o'clock, I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully you have some good questions. Yes?